The snowstorm roared through the forest, its icy winds biting hard. A skinny husky struggled through the deep snow, her ribs showing. Behind her, two small puppies huddled close, shaking with every step. They stumbled often, frost covering their fur, as their mother pushed them forward, desperate for warmth and safety. In a small cabin at the forest's edge, Jack sat by the fire, stirring the soup on his stove. The retired teacher had lived here alone for years, finding peace in the quiet of nature. Outside, the storm battered the windows, but inside, the warmth of the fire filled the room. Jack leaned back in his chair, letting the stillness settle around him. Then he heard it, a faint scratching sound, barely audible over the howling wind. At first, he thought it might be a branch scraping the side of the cabin, but then came a soft whimper. Jack froze, his spoon paused midair, listening intently. There it was again, a small, desperate sound from the front door. Setting his bowl aside, Jack grabbed his coat and moved cautiously toward the sound. The scratching grew more frantic as he approached, followed by another faint cry. He opened the door, and the icy wind rushed in, stinging his face. But what he saw froze him in place. A husky stood in the doorway, her fur covered in snow, patches of frost clinging to her sides. Her ribs pressed against her coat, and her blue eyes locked onto Jack's with a mix of desperation and trust. Behind her, two tiny puppies huddled together, shivering violently as the wind whipped around them. Jack's heart sank. He had lived alone for so long, and the sight of this small family struck something deep inside him. The husky nudged her puppies forward, her movements weak but determined, as if pleading for help. "Where did you come from?" Jack muttered, stepping back to let them out of the cold. "Come on, get inside." The husky hesitated for a moment, glancing at her puppies. Then, as if understanding Jack's intention, she limped forward into the warmth of the cabin, her pups trailing behind her. Jack quickly shut the door, sealing out the biting storm. Inside, the husky sniffed the air cautiously, her sharp eyes scanning the room. The puppies collapsed onto the wooden floor, their small bodies trembling as they leaned into each other. Jack grabbed an old blanket from a nearby chair and spread it out near the fire. "Here," he said softly, pointing to the blanket. "It's warmer there." The mother hesitated, watching Jack with wary eyes. Her body was tense, ready to defend her pups if needed, but exhaustion overcame her, and she slowly moved onto the blanket, curling around her puppies. They pressed into her fur, their trembling easing slightly in the warmth. Jack stood back, unsure of what to do next. He hadn't had animals in the cabin since his wife passed, though she had always loved dogs. Seeing the husky and her puppies stirred old memories he hadn't revisited in years. He moved to the kitchen, rummaging through his supplies. He didn't have much, but he found some leftover chicken and warmed it slightly. Placing the food on a plate, he set it down a few feet from the husky. "Here," Jack said gently, stepping back to give her space. The husky sniffed the air cautiously, her ears twitching. She nudged her pups back with her nose, ensuring the food was safe before approaching. After a moment, she began eating, her movements slow and measured. The puppies, encouraged by their mother, licked at the scraps, their small cries softening. Jack watched them, his heart heavy. How had they survived out there in this storm? He noticed the mother's limp and the frost clinging to her fur. She had clearly been through a lot, yet her focus was entirely on her puppies, keeping them safe. As the storm raged on outside, the firelight flickered across the cabin. Jack sat in his armchair, sipping his soup and watching the family settle in. The mother husky's breathing slowed as she curled protectively around her pups. For the first time that night, the puppies stopped shaking, their tiny bodies nestled into her warmth. Jack felt a mix of emotions, sympathy for their struggle, awe at their resilience, and a quiet sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. They had chosen his door, and now they were his responsibility. "You'll be safe here," Jack murmured, his voice soft. The mother husky lifted her head slightly, her blue eyes meeting his in a moment of silent understanding. Then she rested her head back down, her trust in Jack evident despite her wild nature. As the hours passed, the storm outside showed no signs of stopping. But inside the cabin, there was warmth, safety, and a quiet bond forming between a man and the unexpected family that had come to his door. The snowstorm outside showed no signs of letting up. Jack stood in his kitchen, watching the husky and her puppies settle on the blanket by the fire. The mother husky lay protectively around her pups, her blue eyes watching Jack's every move. Though her body was tense, there was an unspoken understanding between them. Jack moved cautiously, not wanting to startle her, and returned to the kitchen to find more food. Rummaging through his pantry, Jack found a can of tuna and a small pack of sausages. "Not exactly a feast," he muttered, "but it'll do for now." He quickly warmed the food and brought it over, setting the plate near the edge of the blanket. The mother husky sniffed the air, her nose twitching. Slowly she leaned forward and began eating. Her pups watched her, their tiny bodies still trembling from the cold. After a moment, she nudged the plate toward them, letting them eat their share. Jack couldn't help but admire her. Even in her weakened state, her focus was on her puppies. Her resilience stirred something deep in him. He pulled up a chair a few feet away, sipping his coffee as he observed them. The puppies, now slightly more alert, nibbled at the food, their tiny tails wagging faintly. "I guess you weren't planning on being out there for long," Jack said softly, his voice filling the quiet room. The husky glanced at him briefly before lowering her head, resting her chin on her paws. She looked exhausted, her breathing shallow and her injured paw tucked beneath her. Jack frowned, noticing the frost clinging to her fur. The pups, though small, seemed to be in better shape than their mother. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" he murmured, his heart aching for them. He stood and grabbed an old towel from the bathroom. Approaching slowly, he knelt a few feet from the husky. "Let me help," he said gently, holding out the towel. The husky stiffened, her body on high alert. Jack paused, giving her time to adjust. After a moment, she relaxed slightly, though her watchful eyes stayed on him. Jack began dabbing at the frost on her fur, his movements slow and careful. The pups squeaked softly, pressing closer to their mother. The towel grew damp as he wiped away the frost, revealing patches of raw skin underneath. "Poor thing," Jack whispered, his chest tightening. "How did you make it out here?" Once the frost was gone, Jack sat back, giving her space. The husky's gaze softened slightly, though she remained protective of her pups. Jack returned to the kitchen, warming more broth to help rehydrate her. As he worked, memories of his late wife, Margaret, filled his mind. Margaret had always loved animals, especially dogs. She would have been the first to open the door for the husky and her puppies, fussing over them and ensuring they were warm and fed. Jack smiled faintly, imagining her in this moment. "You'd know exactly what to do," he said aloud, his voice tinged with longing. Returning to the living room, Jack placed the bowl of broth near the husky. She sniffed it hesitantly before taking a few cautious laps. Her pups mimicked her, their tiny tongues dipping into the warm liquid. Jack watched them with a quiet sense of satisfaction. They were safe for now. The hours passed, and the storm continued to rage. Jack busied himself with small tasks around the cabin, occasionally glancing over at his unexpected guests. The puppies began to explore their surroundings, their curiosity outweighing their fear. One clumsily stumbled over the edge of the blanket, letting out a tiny yelp as it slipped on the wooden floor. Jack chuckled, crouching to gently guide the pup back to its mother. "Careful there, little one," he said, his voice soft. The mother husky watched him intently, but made no move to stop him. Jack saw this as a sign of trust, however cautious it might be. "I guess you've decided I'm not a threat," he said, standing slowly. "Good, because I'm not." As night fell, Jack prepared a makeshift bed for himself on the couch. He didn't want to leave the husky and her puppies alone in case they needed him. He laid out extra blankets near the fire, ensuring the family stayed warm. The mother husky adjusted herself on the blanket, her injured paw stretching slightly as she relaxed for the first time. Before turning in, Jack stood by the window, peering out into the darkness. The snow was relentless, piling high against the cabin walls. He couldn't help but wonder where the husky had come from and what had driven her to his door. The forest was vast, and the storm made it even more unforgiving. Had she been wandering for days, weeks? The thought troubled him. Returning to the couch, Jack settled in, the fire's glow casting soft shadows across the room. The husky's steady breathing filled the silence, joined by the occasional squeak from her puppies. Jack felt an odd sense of peace despite the storm outside. His cabin, usually quiet and solitary, was now filled with life. As he drifted off to sleep, a thought lingered in his mind. This family had come to him for help, and he couldn't let them down. Whatever their story was, Jack was determined to see them through the storm. The morning arrived quietly, the snowstorm outside finally calming to a gentle flurry. Jack woke to the soft crackle of the fire and the faint rustling near the fireplace. Blinking against the light filtering through the window, he sat up, rubbing his stiff neck. The husky and her puppies were still curled on the blanket, though the puppies were now more active, playfully batting at each other with tiny paws. Jack smiled faintly, watching them. Well, you're getting your energy back, he murmured, stretching as he stood. The mother husky lifted her head, her ears twitching, her blue eyes locked onto Jack, alert but calm. She seemed to be slowly warming to his presence, though her protective instinct was still evident. "Good morning, Luna," Jack said, testing the name he had decided on during the night. It suited her, the quiet strength, the resilience. "What do you think? Does it fit?" Luna tilted her head slightly, almost as if considering his words, before resting her chin back on her paws. Jack chuckled. "I'll take that as a yes." In the kitchen, Jack brewed a pot of coffee, the rich aroma filling the cabin. He prepared breakfast for himself and warmed some chicken and broth for Luna. Setting the bowl down near her, he stepped back to give her space. She sniffed the food cautiously before eating, nudging her puppies aside when they tried to dive in first. "Let her eat first," Jack said gently, crouching to pick up one of the pups. The tiny creature squirmed in his hands, letting out a soft yip. Its fur was fluffier than he had expected, its dark eyes wide with curiosity. Jack cradled the pup for a moment, marveling at its small size before setting it back down on the blanket. The second pup, bolder and more adventurous, had wandered off the blanket and was exploring the cabin. It sniffed at a pair of Jack's boots near the door before attempting to climb into one. Jack laughed softly, shaking his head. "You're a curious one, aren't you?" Luna watched him closely, but didn't interfere. Jack took this as a sign of growing trust. He noticed her injured paw, still swollen and stiff, and decided it needed attention. Grabbing a first aid kit from the bathroom, he approached slowly, kneeling a few feet away from her. "Let's see about that paw," he said softly, holding up a roll of bandages. Luna tensed but didn't move as Jack reached for her leg. Her sharp eyes tracked his every move, but she allowed him to gently examine the injury. The wound wasn't deep, but it was raw and inflamed, likely from days of walking through snow and ice. Jack cleaned the paw with warm water, dabbing at it with a soft cloth. Luna flinched but didn't pull away. "You're a tough one," he murmured, wrapping the paw carefully. "We'll get you back on your feet in no time." The puppies, sensing their mother's discomfort, pressed close to her, their tiny whimpers filling the room. Luna leaned down, licking them reassuringly before settling back onto the blanket. Jack stepped back, giving her space, and sat on the floor nearby. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" he said, more to himself than to Luna. His thoughts drifted to the storm and how far she must have traveled to end up at his door. It wasn't just luck, something had driven her to him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she had chosen him for a reason. Over the next few days, Jack adjusted to life with his unexpected guests. The puppies grew more energetic, exploring every corner of the cabin. They chased each other across the floor, slid on the smooth wood, and occasionally tumbled into Jack's legs. He found himself laughing more than he had in years, their playful antics lifting a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. Luna, though still cautious, began to relax. She allowed Jack to approach her more freely, and even licked his hand once when he brought her food. The bond between them was growing, though Jack respected her boundaries, moving slowly and giving her space when she needed it. As the snow began to melt, Jack ventured outside to gather supplies. The world beyond the cabin was blanketed in white, the forest silent except for the crunch of his boots. He couldn't help but think about Luna's journey through this harsh landscape. She must have been desperate, driven by something stronger than fear to protect her puppies. At the small general store in town, Jack picked up extra supplies, raw meat, blankets, and even a few dog toys for the puppies. The shopkeeper, an older woman named Martha, raised an eyebrow as Jack placed the items on the counter. "Didn't know you had dogs, Jack?" she said, her tone curious. "I didn't," Jack replied with a wry smile. "They found me." Martha's eyes widened. "Wild ones?" Jack nodded. "A husky and her pups. They showed up during the storm." "Well, I'll be," Martha said, shaking her head. "That's rare. They must trust you." Jack considered her words as he made his way back to the cabin. Trust. It wasn't something he had thought about in years, not since Margaret's passing. But Luna's arrival had brought it back into focus, the fragile bond between man and animal growing stronger with each passing day. Back at the cabin, Jack unloaded the supplies and set out the toys for the puppies. They pounced on them immediately, their playful yips filling the room. Luna watched from her spot near the fire, her gaze softening as Jack knelt to scratch behind one puppy's ears. "You're safe now," Jack said quietly, looking at Luna. Her eyes met his, and in that moment, He felt a sense of connection he hadn't known in a long time. This wasn't just a temporary arrangement, he realized. Luna and her pups had become part of his life, and Jack was determined to give them the care they needed, no matter what challenges lay ahead. The following morning, the forest was quieter than it had been in days. The storm had passed, leaving a pristine blanket of snow over the landscape. The sun peeked through the trees, casting long shadows that danced across the cabin walls. Jack stood by the window, sipping his coffee, as he watched the Husky family near the fireplace. Luna seemed calmer now, her blue eyes soft as her puppies tumbled over each other, wrestling on the blanket. Jack couldn't help but smile. The once shivering pups were now bundles of energy, their curiosity growing with each passing day. But as much as the sight warmed him, questions still lingered in his mind. Where had Luna come from? What had driven her to his door? And why did she seem so wary, even now? Determined to find answers, Jack bundled up and stepped outside, the cold air biting at his face. The snow crunched under his boots as he made his way around the cabin, searching for any signs of Luna's arrival. It didn't take long to find them. Tracks, paw prints leading from the edge of the forest to his door, were etched into the snow, partially covered by fresh snowfall. Jack knelt to examine them. The prints were deep, suggesting Luna had carried her weight and that of her puppies as far as she could before seeking refuge. But something else caught his attention. Larger tracks, wider and heavier, followed hers, weaving erratically through the trees before disappearing into the forest. Jack frowned, his breath visible in the crisp air. "Wolves," he muttered, standing up. The tracks were unmistakable. The thought sent a chill down his spine. Had Luna been pursued? The idea of her running through the storm, protecting her pups from predators, made Jack's chest tighten. He turned back toward the cabin, glancing over his shoulder at the tree line. The forest seemed still, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. Back inside, Jack removed his boots and coat, shaking off the cold. Luna lifted her head as he entered, her gaze sharp. She seemed to sense his unease, her ears twitching as she watched him. "You've been through more than you're letting on, haven't you?" Jack said softly, crouching near the fire. One of the puppies, the bolder of the two, stumbled toward him, wagging its tiny tail. Jack reached out, letting the pup sniff his hand before giving it a gentle pat. "You've got some fight in you," he said with a smile. Luna relaxed slightly, resting her head back on her paws. Jack moved to the kitchen, deciding it was time to consult someone who might have more insight. He grabbed his phone and dialed the local vet, Dr. Simmons, a woman he had spoken to occasionally during his trips to town. "Jack, this is a surprise," Dr. Simmons said when she answered. "What can I do for you?" Jack hesitated briefly, unsure of how to explain the situation. "I've got some unexpected guests," he said finally. "A husky and her puppies showed up during the storm. I'm trying to take care of them, but I'm no expert." There was a pause on the other end. "Wild husky, you say? That's unusual. Are they all right?" "They're holding up," Jack replied. "The mother has a limp, and she's thin. The puppies seem okay, just a bit small. I was hoping you might have some advice." Dr. Simmons asked a few more questions, her tone growing more curious with each answer Jack gave. "It sounds like the mother has been through a lot," she said. "If you can bring them in, I'd be happy to take a look. But if that's not possible, just keep her warm, fed, and hydrated. Let her rest. As for the limp, it sounds like she's already trusting you enough to let you handle her. That's a good sign." Jack glanced over at Luna, who was now dozing near the fire. "She's tough," he said quietly. "And those pups, there's something special about them." Dr. Simmons chuckled. "Huskies are resilient creatures, but it's rare for a wild one to approach a person, especially with puppies in tow. She must have known you'd help her." After hanging up, Jack felt a renewed sense of determination. He prepared a bowl of food for Luna and her pups, setting it down by the fire. The puppies scampered over, their tiny tails wagging as they ate. Luna watched them closely, her maternal instinct evident. Jack sat nearby, his thoughts returning to the wolf tracks. If Luna had been running from a pack, there was a chance they might come back. He decided to keep an eye on the area, ensuring the safety of his new guests. Later that day, Jack ventured outside to gather more firewood. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the forest. As he stacked the logs by the cabin, he noticed movement near the tree line. Squinting, he caught a glimpse of something darting between the trees, a flash of gray fur. Jack froze, his heart racing. He stood still, waiting for the figure to reappear, but the forest remained silent. Shaking his head, he finished stacking the firewood and headed inside, bolting the door behind him. Just my imagination, he muttered, though the nagging feeling of being watched lingered. That night, as the fire crackled and the cabin grew quiet, Jack sat in his armchair, watching Luna and her pups. The puppies were curled up against their mother, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each breath. Luna's ears twitched occasionally, her eyes half closed but alert. Jack leaned back, his gaze drifting to the window. The forest outside was dark and still, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Luna's journey wasn't over, and that his role in it was only just beginning. The cabin was quiet, save for the crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of Luna and her puppies. Jack sat by the window, his eyes scanning the dark forest beyond. The flash of gray he had seen earlier still weighed heavily on his mind. Wolves. It had to be wolves. Their presence added a layer of unease to the already mysterious circumstances surrounding Luna's arrival. As the hours dragged on, Jack dozed off in his armchair, the warmth of the fire lulling him into a restless sleep. He dreamed of the forest, of shadows moving among the trees and Luna running through the snow, her pups trailing behind her. In his dream, the wolves were closer than he realized, their howls echoing in the cold night. A sharp sound jolted him awake. Jack sat up, his heart pounding. He listened closely, the room eerily silent except for the faint rustle of movement near the door. Luna was awake now, too, her ears pricked and her body tense. She let out a low growl, her blue eyes locked on the cabin door. Jack stood slowly, his senses on high alert. The sound came again, a faint scratching, followed by the crunch of snow. He grabbed his flashlight and rifle, moving cautiously toward the window. Peering outside, he swept the beam of light across the yard. At first, he saw nothing but the snow-covered ground and the shadows of the trees. Then, just at the edge of the forest, the beam caught a glint of eyes, yellow, sharp, and unblinking. "Damn," Jack whispered under his breath. He could make out the shape of a large wolf, its body partially hidden behind the trees. As the light hit it, the wolf retreated into the shadows, but Jack knew it hadn't gone far. Luna's growl grew louder, and her puppies whimpered, pressing closer to her. Jack turned off the flashlight, not wanting to draw more attention. He moved back to the fireplace, setting the rifle within reach. Luna's protective instincts were on full display as she stood, positioning herself between her pups and the door. "Easy, girl," Jack said softly, trying to calm her. "They won't get in. Not while I'm here." The night dragged on, tension thick in the air. Every sound outside felt amplified. The creak of the trees, the crunch of snow, the faint whisper of the wind. Jack stayed awake, his grip tightening on the rifle each time Luna's ears twitched. As dawn broke, the forest began to stir with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. Jack cautiously stepped outside, the cold morning air biting at his face. The yard was quiet, but the tracks in the snow told a different story. Large paw prints circled the cabin, weaving in and out of the tree line. Jack followed them for a few yards before they disappeared into the forest. Returning to the cabin, Jack found Luna still alert, her body tense even as her puppies nursed. He knelt beside her, reaching out to gently scratch behind her ears. She flinched at first, but then relaxed slightly, leaning into his hand. "They're gone for now," Jack said quietly, "but I don't think this is over." Determined to protect Luna and her pups, Jack spent the day reinforcing the cabin. He checked the locks on the doors and windows, stacked firewood near the entrance, and even set up a makeshift barrier with some old furniture. Luna watched him closely, her gaze following his every move. It was as if she understood his efforts were for her and her family. That evening, Jack prepared a hearty meal, sharing bits of meat with Luna and her pups. The puppies seemed oblivious to the tension, chasing each other around the room and tumbling over the blankets. Their playful yips brought a faint smile to Jack's face, a brief reprieve from the lingering worry in his chest. As night fell, Jack sat by the fire, keeping one hand on the rifle resting against his chair. Luna lay nearby, her body curled protectively around her pups. The warmth of the fire filled the cabin, but the unease from the previous night lingered. Jack's mind wandered as he stared into the flames. He thought about Luna's journey, the dangers she had faced, and the trust she had placed in him. Her resilience reminded him of Margaret, how she had always been the strong one, the anchor in their life together. Losing her had left Jack adrift, but Luna and her pups had brought a sense of purpose back into his life. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise, a distant howl, low and mournful. Luna's head shot up, her ears swiveling toward the sound. Jack stiffened, gripping the rifle. The howl was joined by another, then another, until the forest echoed with the haunting chorus of a wolf pack. "They're back," Jack muttered, standing. He moved to the window, his flashlight in hand, but this time he didn't turn it on. Instead, he stood in the darkness, listening to the howls grow louder. Luna growled softly, standing protectively over her puppies. The howls seemed to circle the cabin, moving closer and then farther away, as if the wolves were testing the boundaries. Jack's pulse quickened, his mind racing. He couldn't let them get any closer, but firing a shot might provoke them. For hours, the wolves lingered, their howls weaving through the night. Luna stayed on high alert, her body a shield for her pups. Jack didn't sleep, his eyes darting between the window and the door, his hands ready to defend the fragile family that had sought his protection. Finally, as dawn approached, the howls faded, and the forest grew quiet once more. Jack exhaled a shaky breath, his grip on the rifle loosening. Luna relaxed slightly, though her ears remained perked. The danger wasn't over, Jack knew that much. But as he looked at Luna and her pups, he also knew one thing for certain. He would do whatever it took to keep them safe. The night of the wolves' visit lingered in Jack's mind long after the howls faded. He found himself watching the forest with a sharper eye, every shadow and movement fueling his suspicion. But inside the cabin, life was slowly taking on a rhythm. Luna seemed to sense Jack's commitment to protecting her family, and, little by little, she began to trust him. The puppies were thriving, their tiny bodies growing stronger with each passing day. They tumbled around the cabin in bursts of energy, testing their legs and pouncing on invisible prey. Jack had taken to calling them Shadow and Spark, Shadow for the quieter, more cautious one, and Spark for the bold, adventurous troublemaker. "You two are a handful," Jack muttered one morning, as Spark tried to climb into his boot, wagging his little tail furiously. Luna watched from her spot by the fireplace, her sharp blue eyes softening at the sight of her playful pups. Jack knelt down, gently scooping Spark out of the boot. The puppy squirmed in his hands, letting out a tiny bark that made Jack chuckle. Shadow, meanwhile, hung back, watching the interaction with wide eyes. Jack reached out his hand, palm up, and waited. Slowly, Shadow crept forward, sniffing cautiously before giving Jack's fingers a tentative lick. "Well, aren't you brave today?" Jack said softly, stroking Shadow's head. The puppy wagged his tail slightly before retreating to Luna's side. Luna's trust had grown in small but meaningful ways. She no longer flinched when Jack moved near her, and she allowed him to tend to her injured paw without protest. Jack had taken to sitting beside her in the evenings, talking to her in a low, soothing voice as he changed her bandages. She listened quietly, her gaze steady and calm. "You're a good mother, Luna," Jack said one night, gently wrapping her paw. "You've been through hell, but you've kept them safe. That's something special." Luna tilted her head slightly, her ears twitching at his tone. Jack smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't known in years. The cabin, once a place of solitude and silence, was now filled with life, and Jack found that he didn't mind the change. Determined to give Luna and her pups the best care possible, Jack made a trip to town for supplies. At the general store, he picked up more raw meat, vitamins for Luna's recovery, and a few small toys for the puppies. Martha, the shopkeeper, raised an eyebrow as he placed the items on the counter. "Still taking care of that husky?" she asked. "Sure am," Jack replied. "She's got 2 pups with her, and they're keeping me on my toes." Martha chuckled. "Sounds like they've made themselves at home." "They have," Jack said, smiling faintly, "but I think they needed a home more than I realized." Back at the cabin, Jack laid out the new toys for the puppies. Spark immediately pounced on a rubber ball, his tiny paws batting it across the floor. Shadow hung back, sniffing at a plush chew dog before tentatively picking it up in his mouth. Luna watched from her spot by the fire, her tail wagging slightly at the sight of her pup's excitement. As the days passed, Jack noticed Luna becoming more comfortable with her surroundings. She explored the cabin cautiously, her nose sniffing every corner. Jack often found her watching him from a distance, her sharp eyes filled with curiosity. He spoke to her often, keeping his voice calm and steady, and over time, she began to approach him more freely. One evening, as Jack sat by the fire, Luna surprised him by walking over and resting her head on his knee. Jack froze, his heart racing at the unexpected gesture. Slowly he reached out, letting his hand hover near her head. Luna didn't flinch. Instead, she closed her eyes, leaning into his touch as he gently scratched behind her ears. "Well, would you look at that?" Jack murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" Luna stayed like that for a moment before retreating to her spot near the fire. Jack watched her, a mix of pride and gratitude swelling in his chest. Their bond was fragile but growing, built on a foundation of patience and trust. The puppies, too, had grown more attached to Jack. Spark often followed him around the cabin, his tiny paws pattering against the floor. Shadow, though more reserved, had started curling up near Jack's feet during the evenings. Jack found himself laughing more often, their playful antics brightening even the coldest days. But the memory of the wolves lingered. Jack kept his rifle close and made a point of checking the area around the cabin each morning. He hadn't seen any more tracks since that night, but he wasn't taking any chances. One morning, while gathering firewood, Jack noticed Luna standing at the window, her ears perked and her body tense. She watched him intently, her protective instincts as sharp as ever. Jack gave her a reassuring wave before heading back inside. "You're keeping an eye on me, huh?" he said, setting the firewood near the hearth. Luna's gaze softened as she sat down, her puppies tumbling over each other at her feet. Jack knelt beside her, resting a hand on her head. "Don't worry, girl. I've got your back." As the fire crackled and the cabin filled with the soft sounds of life, Jack felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Luna and her pups had brought something back into his life that he thought he'd lost forever, a sense of purpose and the quiet joy of companionship. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The days had grown longer, and the snow outside was beginning to melt. Jack was settling into his new routine with Luna and her pups, Shadow and Spark. The once quiet cabin now buzzed with life, their playful yips and curious adventures filling the space. Jack found himself looking forward to mornings, when Spark would wake him by pawing at his blanket, or Shadow would curl up next to him by the fire. But the memory of the wolves still lingered, gnawing at the edges of his mind. Jack made it a habit to check the perimeter of the cabin each morning, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The tracks he'd seen before had disappeared with the melting snow, but the feeling of being watched had not. One crisp morning, Jack ventured farther into the forest, hoping to find any signs of what might still be lurking. The ground was damp, and patches of frost clung stubbornly to shaded areas. Luna stood by the cabin window, watching him as he disappeared into the trees. Jack moved cautiously, his eyes scanning the ground and the trees for anything unusual. He found broken branches and scattered tufts of fur, likely signs of a scuffle, but nothing definitive. As he knelt to examine a set of faint tracks, a sudden sound made him freeze. A low growl echoed through the trees, distant but unmistakable. Jack's hand tightened around his rifle as he rose slowly, his heart pounding. He scanned the area, his eyes darting between the shadows. The growl came again, closer this time. It was a deep, guttural sound that sent a chill down his spine. "Wolves," he whispered under his breath. They were out there, watching him, testing the boundaries. Jack backed away slowly, his boots crunching against the damp ground. He kept his rifle raised, ready to defend himself if necessary, but the growls faded as he neared the cabin. Luna was at the door when he returned, her blue eyes sharp and alert. She sniffed at his boots, her tail stiff as she moved to the window, scanning the tree line. "You sensed them, didn't you?" Jack said, setting his rifle by the door. Luna didn't respond, but her tense posture spoke volumes. She knew the danger wasn't over. That evening, Jack fortified the cabin further, adding more barriers to the windows and doors. He set traps near the edge of the yard, hoping to deter any unwelcome visitors. Luna followed him as he worked, her injured paw still stiff but healing well. She stayed close, her protective instincts as strong as ever. As night fell, the forest grew eerily quiet. Jack sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle while Luna lay nearby, her puppies nestled against her. The warmth of the fire filled the room, but the unease in Jack's chest lingered. The quiet was broken by a distant howl. Jack froze, his hand gripping the rifle tightly. The howl was long and mournful, echoing through the trees. Luna lifted her head, her ears twitching. The puppies whimpered, pressing closer to her. Another howl joined the first, then another, until the forest was alive with their haunting cries. Jack stood, his body tense as he moved to the window. Peering into the darkness, he searched for any sign of movement. The tree line remained still, but the howls grew louder, closer. Luna stood, her body a shield between the door and her pups. She growled low in her throat, her fur bristling as she scanned the room. Jack glanced at her, their eyes meeting in a moment of silent understanding. "They're testing us," Jack murmured, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "But they're not getting in." He stayed by the window, watching and waiting, as the howls circled the cabin. The The wolves seemed to be moving, their cries weaving through the forest like a warning. Jack's finger hovered over the trigger of his rifle, ready to defend the fragile family that had come to depend on him. The howls continued for hours, a relentless reminder of the danger lurking just beyond the safety of the cabin. Luna remained vigilant, her growls soft but steady, as she stood guard over her pups. Jack didn't sleep, his eyes darting between the window and the door, his body ready for action at any moment. Finally, as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, the howls faded, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. Jack exhaled a shaky breath, his grip on the rifle loosening. Luna relaxed slightly, though her eyes remained sharp. "They're gone for now," Jack said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "But they'll be back." The sun rose higher, casting warm light over the cabin and melting the remaining frost. Jack stepped outside, his boots crunching against the damp ground, as he surveyed the yard. The traps he had set remained untouched, but faint tracks in the dirt confirmed his fears. The wolves had been close, closer than before. Back inside, Jack found Luna watching him from her spot by the fire. Shadow and Spark were tumbling over each other, oblivious to the tension that hung in the air. Jack knelt beside Luna, resting a hand on her head. "We'll figure this out," he said softly. "I'm not letting anything happen to you or the pups." Luna leaned into his touch, her blue eyes meeting his with a quiet resolve. Jack felt a surge of determination. He didn't know why Luna had chosen his door, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let her down. The wolves were out there, but so was Jack, and he was ready for whatever came next. The days following the wolves' second appearance were tense. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the pack wasn't just passing through. They were watching, waiting. Luna seemed to sense it too. She stayed closer to the cabin, her sharp blue eyes always scanning the tree line. Even her pups, usually carefree and playful, seemed more cautious, sticking close to their mother. Jack spent his mornings reinforcing the cabin and his evenings preparing for the worst. He doubled the traps around the perimeter and made sure the rifle was always within reach. He also worked on keeping Luna and her pups as comfortable as possible, though the unease in the air made it hard for anyone to relax. One cold afternoon, Jack ventured into the woods to check the traps he'd set the day before. The snow had melted enough to reveal patches of damp earth, and Jack moved cautiously, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Luna watched him leave from the window, her body tense as if she didn't want him to go. The traps were untouched, but Jack found fresh tracks in the mud, large paw prints that crisscrossed the area around the cabin. He crouched to inspect them, his stomach tightening. The prints were deliberate, circling close but never too close, as if the wolves were testing his defenses. "They're toying with us," Jack muttered, standing and scanning the forest. The trees were quiet, their bare branches swaying gently in the cold wind, but the silence was unnerving, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Suddenly, a rustling sound broke the stillness. Jack froze, his hand tightening on the rifle. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by a low growl. Jack turned, his eyes darting between the shadows, until he spotted it. A lone wolf standing a few yards away, its yellow eyes locked onto him. The wolf was massive, its fur dark and matted. It growled again, its body low and tense, as if daring Jack to make a move. Jack raised his rifle but didn't fire. He knew better than to provoke it. Instead, he stepped back slowly, his heart pounding. The wolf didn't follow. Instead, it let out a long, mournful howl that echoed through the forest. Moments later, other howls answered, surrounding Jack in a chilling symphony. He turned and hurried back to the cabin, his breath visible in the cold air as he pushed through the trees. When Jack reached the yard, Luna was waiting at the door, her ears pinned back and her body stiff. She sniffed the air, growling softly as Jack bolted the door behind him. Shadow and Spark huddled near the fireplace, their tiny bodies trembling as if they too sensed the danger. "They're getting closer," Jack said, his voice low as he set the rifle by the door. He crouched near Luna, resting a hand on her head. "But we're ready for them. They won't get to you or the pups." Luna licked his hand, a small gesture of trust that bolstered Jack's resolve. He spent the rest of the evening fortifying the cabin, checking the traps, and ensuring every door and window was secure. The weight of responsibility hung heavy on him, but he refused to let it overwhelm him. As night fell, the howls returned. They were louder this time, closer, weaving through the forest like a warning. Jack stayed by the window, his rifle in hand, while Luna stood guard near the door. Her pups stayed curled on the blanket, their small whimpers barely audible over the haunting cries. Hours passed, and the howls continued. Jack's body ached from tension, his grip on the rifle never loosening. Luna was just as vigilant, her growls soft but constant as she watched the door. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the howls stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, every creak of the cabin amplified in the absence of sound. Jack remained on high alert, scanning the yard through the window. The wolves were out there, he was sure of it, but they were waiting for something. As dawn approached, Jack finally allowed himself to relax. The danger wasn't over, but the wolves had retreated for now. He turned to Luna, who was still standing near the door, her body stiff. "They'll be back," Jack said softly, crouching beside her. "But so will we. We'll face them together." Luna leaned into him, her eyes reflecting both exhaustion and determination. Jack scratched behind her ears, his own weariness threatening to overtake him. "You've got a fight in you," he said, his voice tinged with admiration. "And so do I." That morning, as the sun rose over the forest, Jack made a decision. He couldn't keep living in defense, waiting for the wolves to make their move. He needed a plan, one that would protect Luna and her pups while putting an end to the wolves' encroachment once and for all. With Luna by his side and the pups safe inside, Jack began to prepare for the next confrontation. The forest was their home now, and Jack wasn't about to let the wolves take it from them. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the snow-dappled ground. Jack sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands, his mind racing. The wolves had been testing the cabin for days now, their howls a constant reminder of the danger that lingered just beyond the tree line. It was time to take action. Luna lay by the fireplace, her pups nestled close to her. Shadow was dozing, but Spark, ever the adventurer, wiggled free and began pawing at the edge of the blanket. Jack couldn't help but smile at the sight, though the weight of responsibility pulled at him. "All right," Jack said aloud, standing. "We can't keep living like this." He glanced at Luna, who lifted her head, her blue eyes meeting his. "We're going to figure this out." Jack spent the morning gathering supplies. He reinforced the traps around the perimeter, adding sharper stakes and heavier weights. He also packed his backpack with essentials: food, water, rope, and ammunition. If he was going to confront the wolves, he needed to be prepared for anything. Luna watched him from the window as he worked, her ears twitching at every sound. Jack could see the tension in her posture, the way her body remained poised and ready. She knew the wolves were still out there, and she wasn't about to let her guard down. Once his preparations were complete, Jack returned to the cabin and crouched by the fire, scratching behind Luna's ears. "I'm not going far," he said softly, "just to see what we're dealing with. You stay here with the pups." Luna leaned into his touch, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. Jack stood, grabbing his rifle and slinging the backpack over his shoulder. He glanced at Shadow and Spark, who were tumbling over each other on the blanket. "You two behave," he said with a faint smile before stepping outside. The forest was eerily quiet as Jack moved through the trees. The snow had melted enough to reveal patches of muddy ground, and his boots left deep prints with every step. He followed the tracks he had seen the day before, his rifle at the ready. As he ventured deeper into the woods, the tracks became more erratic, weaving through the trees and doubling back in places. Jack frowned, crouching to inspect a fresh set of paw prints. They were large and deep, the claws visible in the soft earth. "They're close," Jack muttered, rising slowly. He scanned the area, his eyes darting between the shadows. The air was thick with tension, every rustle of leaves sending his pulse racing. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the trees. Jack froze, his grip tightening on the rifle. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of something moving through the underbrush. Jack turned, his eyes locking onto the source of the noise. A wolf stepped into view, its dark fur blending with the shadows. Its yellow eyes glinted in the dim light, sharp and unblinking. Jack raised his rifle but didn't fire. The wolf stared at him, its body low and tense, as if gauging his intentions. "Not today," Jack said under his breath, taking a slow step back. The wolf growled again but didn't advance. Instead, it let out a sharp bark, and moments later, another wolf appeared, then another. Jack's stomach tightened as the small pack formed a loose circle around him. He moved cautiously, his rifle trained on the nearest wolf. They didn't attack, but their movements were calculated, their eyes never leaving him. Jack realized they were hurting him, guiding him away from the cabin. His mind raced as he considered his options. He couldn't lead them back to Luna and the pups, but he also couldn't risk staying out here too long. After what felt like an eternity, the wolves stopped, their bodies tense as they held their ground. Jack took the opportunity to back away slowly, his rifle still raised. When he was a safe distance away, he turned and hurried back toward the cabin, his heart pounding. The sun was beginning to set when Jack finally reached the clearing. Luna was at the window, her body rigid as she watched him approach. He bolted the door behind him, setting the rifle down and catching his breath. "They're testing us," Jack said, his voice heavy with frustration. "They're smart, too smart." Luna growled softly, her ears pinned back as she sniffed the air. The pups whimpered, sensing their mother's unease. Jack knelt by the fire, his hand resting on Luna's head. "We're not giving up," he said firmly, "but we need a new plan." That evening, Jack mapped out the area around the cabin, marking the locations of the traps and the routes the wolves seemed to favor. He decided to set up a more secure perimeter, using ropes and bells to create an early warning system. If the wolves came close again, he would know. He also began researching wolf behavior, poring over books and articles on his old laptop. He learned about pack dynamics, territorial instincts, and the methods wolves use to intimidate threats. The more he read, the more he realized the wolves weren't just hungry, they were protecting something. "What are you hiding?" Jack wondered aloud, glancing at Luna. She was curled up by the fire, her pups nestled against her side. Her blue eyes met his briefly before she closed them, her body relaxing for the first time in hours. Jack leaned back in his chair, exhaustion pulling at him. The wolves were relentless, but so was he. As he stared into the flickering flames, he made a silent promise to Luna and her pups. No matter what, he would protect them. The wolves returned 2 nights later. Jack had been expecting them, but the intensity of their howls shook him nonetheless. He sat by the fire, rifle in hand, while Luna stood at the door, her body a shield between her puppies and the danger outside. Shadow and Spark whimpered, their tiny bodies trembling as they huddled together on the blanket. The warning bells Jack had set up earlier that day jangled faintly in the cold wind. He had created the system using spare rope and bits of metal, weaving it around the cabin's perimeter. Now, as the howls grew louder, the bells began to jingle more frequently, signaling movement just beyond the tree line. "They're testing us again," Jack murmured, glancing at Luna. She growled low in her throat, her sharp blue eyes locked on the door. Jack moved to the window, peering into the dark forest. The moonlight reflected off the snow, casting eerie shadows across the yard. Movement caught his eye, a flash of gray fur darting between the trees, then another, and another. The pack was circling, their glowing eyes glinting in the night. The first howl came, long and mournful, followed by a chorus of others. Jack's grip on the rifle tightened. This time, they weren't just testing, they were closing in. Jack turned to Luna. "Stay here, protect the pups." He crouched briefly, stroking her head. She leaned into his touch, but her body remained tense, ready to defend her family. He stepped outside, the freezing air biting at his face. The forest was alive with movement, the wolves weaving in and out of the shadows. Jack aimed his rifle toward the tree line, his voice steady but firm, as he shouted, "Stay back!" A deep growl answered him, closer than he anticipated. Jack turned just in time to see a wolf step into the clearing, its massive frame silhouetted against the moonlight. It was the same wolf he'd seen before, its dark fur and piercing yellow eyes unmistakable. It stood motionless, its gaze fixed on Jack, as if daring him to act. Jack didn't lower his rifle, but he didn't fire either. Something about the wolf's stance made him pause. It wasn't attacking, it was waiting. "What do you want?" Jack muttered under his breath fogging in the icy air. The wolf's ears twitched at his voice, and for a moment, Jack thought he saw something in its eyes. An intelligence, a purpose. The wolf let out a sharp bark, and suddenly the rest of the pack appeared. They emerged from the shadows one by one, their bodies low and tense as they surrounded the cabin. Jack's heart raced, but he held his ground, the rifle steady in his hands. Inside the cabin, Luna growled, her body pressed against the door. Jack could hear the puppies whimpering, their fear piercing the tense silence. He stepped back toward the cabin, his eyes never leaving the pack. Then, as if on cue, the lead wolf let out a bone-chilling howl. The pack echoed the call, their cries weaving into a haunting symphony that seemed to shake the very ground. Jack's pulse quickened, his finger hovering over the trigger. But before he could fire, something unexpected happened. The wolves stopped. They stood still, their bodies tense but unmoving, as if waiting for a signal. The lead wolf stepped forward, its yellow eyes locked onto Jack. It growled softly, then turned its head toward the forest, letting out a short, sharp bark. To Jack's astonishment, the pack began to retreat. One by one, they slinked back into the shadows, their glowing eyes disappearing into the darkness. The lead wolf lingered, its gaze fixed on Jack. Then, with a flick of its tail, it too disappeared into the trees. Jack lowered his rifle, his mind racing. The pack could have attacked. They had the numbers, the advantage, but they didn't. Instead, they had retreated, leaving Jack with more questions than answers. Back inside, Jack bolted the door and slumped against it, his heart still pounding. Luna was waiting for him, her ears perked and her body tense. She sniffed at him, her blue eyes filled with concern. "They're gone," Jack said, his voice hoarse. "At least for now." Luna growled softly, pacing near the door. The pups, sensing the danger had passed, began to relax, their tiny yips breaking the tense silence. Jack crouched near the fire, resting his head in his hands. "What was that all about?" he muttered. The wolves had acted with purpose, but their retreat felt deliberate, almost calculated. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were trying to tell him something. Over the next few days, Jack stayed close to the cabin, keeping a watchful eye on the forest. He found no fresh tracks, no signs of the pack's return. Luna, too, seemed more at ease, though she never strayed far from her pups. Jack spent his evenings poring over his research on wolf behavior, trying to make sense of the encounter. He learned that wolves often acted to protect their territory or send warnings, but their actions that night didn't fully align with what he read. It was as if they were testing his resolve, or Luna's. As the snow began to melt and the forest came alive with the sounds of spring, Jack knew one thing for certain. The wolves weren't finished with them. Whether they were testing, warning, or something else entirely, their presence lingered in the shadows. And Jack, standing by the window with Luna by his side, vowed to be ready.